My name is Rory Spowers. I've been an environmental writer and campaigner for the last 25 years or so, and I am absolutely delighted and very grateful to the Port Eliot team for giving me this amazing, spectacular room here for the next 3 days between 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock to discuss a number of very crucial topics around our global situation. I felt that 20 years ago I wrote a book called Rising Tides, which is here, and at that time, and basically the title was obviously about the rising tides of world sea levels, but it was also about the rising tide of opposition to the worldview or the paradigm or the economic machine or whatever you want to call it that is basically destroying the life systems of our planet. And at the time, I first came across a quote by Buckminster Fuller, the design guru, innovator, amazing character back in the 50s and 60s, where he said, "You never create change by fighting the existing reality. You only create change by building a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And that really massively struck a chord with me 20 years ago, and it actually has sort of been my sort of lodestar ever since, in a sense, because I think that many of the regenerative systems solutions to our problems don't get the airtime, column inches, mainstream media attention that they really deserve, and that a large proportion of us are left in this position amidst the horror of what's going on, believing that there aren't any alternatives or solutions to any of these issues. They get sort of swept under the carpet. And as much as I really massively admire what the Extinction Rebellion are doing, and as I completely 100% endorse that, and I completely believe that this is absolutely necessary to rattle the cage, and as Martin Luther King famously said, dissent without civil disobedience is consent. We need that to be going on. We need to be tackling things at the top and the people who are in current positions of influence and power. But I think it's equally, if not more important, that we also give as much attention as possible to the potential solutions to these issues and what a viable alternative model might look like. So that is what this is all about, and that's what we're launching here today. And I've chosen 6 topics to concentrate on, starting today with food, and then following on from that this afternoon with my brother Hugo, who's here with his amazing hydrogen fuel cell car, which you might have seen outside. An amazing pioneering innovator in that area, not just with the technology, but also in terms of embracing these circular economic principles within his business model. And then tomorrow we'll be talking about health, actually mainly about drug policy reform and psychedelic medicine research with Amanda Fielding, Dr. David Luke, and David Restrepo from Columbia. Then we're also talking with Jojo Mehta, Polly Higgins' co-founding partner behind the Eradicating Ecocide initiative. And then on Sunday with Shane Mouse, who's sitting here at the front, who I hope you'll go and see his amazing comedy show on the Park stage tomorrow afternoon. And then I'm also talking with Bruce Parry, who's also talking this evening at 7 p.m. in the Park stage around community issues. And then on Sunday afternoon with Russell Brand in the Park stage around consciousness. And Shane and I are talking about consciousness too, and really how our understanding of who and what we are in relation to nature and the rest of the universe might actually be pivotal to reframing all of these massive questions. So I hope that gives you some kind of understanding of what we're trying to do here. It's about trying to move the conversation forward. It's about trying to open up discussions around these key areas that really need to be had, and to really kind of give people a sense of hope in these very dark times, and to try and actually put the word out there that it isn't necessarily a done deal. I think I read 2 books back to back just very recently, one of which was An Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, the deputy editor of the New York Times, who famously wrote an article last year about climate change, which was the most widely read article ever published, apparently, certainly through the New Yorker. And he went on to write a book which is an absolutely devastating distillation of the latest climate science. And I think it's an important book for people to read, but I must say, you get to the end of that book and you're ready to sort of just go home and sort of bury yourself in a hole. But I then also read Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, about the extraordinary work they've done on the Knepp estate in Kent. And I've rarely read a book in my life that's given me such a sense of hope. So I think that it's important to recognise that there are mechanisms and solutions out there, and not least within the agriculture sector and the possibilities for regenerative agriculture, which is what we're going to talk about now with Colin. So thank you very much and welcome, Colin.
Thank you.
Colin, I'll just give you a little introduction and then we'll sort of launch.
Great.
Colin is a biologist and an author. He's written a number of fascinating books, most notably a wonderful book about trees, a book called Good Food for Everyone Forever, which is the title of our talk today. A book called 6 Steps Back to the Land, which I first came across 2 or 3 years ago, and which was a huge book for me, and really changed my mind about a number of things, which is probably what I'd sort of like to start off with now. But also we have a shared keen interest in the sort of metaphysical, dare I say it, spiritual aspect of all of what's going on, and that the need for us to really look at those big questions if we're going to re-inform our economics and our politics in a way that actually makes all of these things possible, because probably without that, most of these things are very difficult for us to actually implement. So Colin, 6 Steps Back to the Land. I highly recommend everybody who's interested in these issues goes and buys a copy at the booksellers in the walled garden here. And I think for me it blew away a number of sort of big, indoctrinated, sort of enculturated sort of ideas about our food system. One, the notion that we need sort of massive centralized monocultures to feed the world, that we're running out of food. This is simply not true, as UN figures show. We're calorifically producing enough food on the planet to feed twice the human population, something like 12, 13 billion people. The problem is, of course, distribution, and when you won't recognize that something like 25% or up to a third of the food that enters the American food marketplace ends up in the trash, you begin to realize this is more a matter of distribution and what is grown where, how it's farmed, and all of these things. So that was a huge takeaway from Colin's book. Also, the degree to which sort of food lobbying groups have distorted our ideas about nutrition and what's good and bad for you. How the sugar lobby has massively repressed all the evidence about sugar, that the emphasis is all being put on fats, and fats across the board, that all fats are bad. Well, we now know that all of this is absolutely not true. The fundamental role that livestock can play in regenerating topsoil, and the whole issue around soil carbon, which I really want to talk to Colin about, and the ability for us to actually sequester, draw down carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil through photosynthesis, through biological methods, and through farming. So I really highly recommend that, but it's full of amazing information. So Colin, can I just launch in around that book and how that came about, and a concise idea of your vision of how good food for everyone forever could be possible?
Well, as you said, I started life as a biologist, but I first started getting seriously involved in agriculture in the 1970s. For a time, actually, I could say for fun, but that sounds a bit lordly. I just wanted to. I worked for Farmers Weekly for 2 or 3 years, and that was a wonderful eye-opener. The 1970s was really, I'd say, the last of what we might call traditional farming. It was in the 1970s that I first heard the very chilled expression, farming is just a business like any other. And later in the decade, of course, we started to see the introduction of neoliberalism, where first of all, the whole world was conceived as a business like any other, and secondly, business itself was reconceived. I mean, I've got nothing against business, but business should be seen as a sort of natural underpinning of a democratic society. And under neoliberalism, it's really seen as a way of maximizing wealth. So it's a double whammy. And once you start saying, agriculture is just a business like any other, a business is just a way of making money, then you're in deep shtuck. And basically the things you need to do in order to maximize wealth in the present economy, stress that, are the complete opposite, more or less, of what you need to do if you're seriously interested in trying to feed people at a very high standard without wrecking the rest of the world. And I started writing books about agriculture at that point, but sometime after that, it occurred to me that the kind of farming we really need is what I have been calling for some years enlightened agriculture. And enlightened in both senses, the sort of 18th century sense of it being very sensible and rational, but also in the sort of Buddhist sense of it being spiritually okay and in tune with the universe. So enlightened agriculture, which is sometimes shortened to real farming, which is why we have the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And I'll just plug, I'm now starting a college to be called the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, which is really about everything, but that's the focus of it. Where am I going with this? Anyway, the point you made, it was at that time too, also in the 1970s, 1974, the world's first ever World Food Conference was held by the United Nations in Rome, where I was lucky enough to go, and it was convened, believe it or not, by Henry Kissinger, who was trying to emerge as the savior of the world. Anyway, when I went to the World Food Conference, I was shocked, frankly, as a young chap, to discover that whereas I'd expected lots and lots of very serious-minded people to be seriously focused on the problems of how to grow enough food, actually they, with a few exceptions, all of whom had their own axes to grind, they were focused on saying it's not our fault and what we're doing is great, so lay off. The British were very guilty of that, you know. We've got our industrial farming agenda and that's it and that's good, and if you only followed us you'd be okay, and basically that's what they all said. So that was rather shocking. And it was then several pennies started to drop. One is that if we really want farming that will actually provide everybody with good food without wrecking the rest of the world, A, that this is perfectly possible despite what we're told, and B, that if we want it to happen, then we can't rely on governments and we can't rely on big business, what you might call the oligarchy, to deliver. And it has to, we need a complete rethink across the board, because agriculture can't be put right ad hoc. Nothing can be put right ad hoc. We need, as you intimated, we also need to rethink the economy to support the kind of agriculture we need. We need to rethink governance, which will introduce the kind of economy, etc., that we need. We need the moral underpinning to say, well, why does it matter? We need the right kind of science, which is, we'll talk about that perhaps, because it's an interesting little side issue. And as you also said, we need the metaphysical underpinning. It's the metaphysical underpinning, the thing that's gone missing. But this is what sort of is the intellectual equivalent or counterpart of what one calls spirituality. In other words, a sense that there is a harmony in the universe which we should be in tune with, etc., etc. That needs a complete rethink. And it was then that it first started to occur to me, this is so... Can I just get some of this water? Of course. Excuse me. Ooh. Thirsty work. But the other thing you said at the beginning, which I very much want to pick up on, is this idea that it's going to be impossible to provide everybody with good food without the big machines and without the agrochemistry and without the genetic engineering, etc., etc., etc. And there's a huge lobby, obviously, that is pushing that idea. And the lobby is basically the food industry, food processors industry, the agrochemicals industry, which now includes the genetic engineering industry, includes big farmers themselves, and of course government love this agenda because, well, governments like ours, because this is what generates a lot of money and that's what they're interested in, the multiplication of GDP, measurable wealth, etc. Not only does it increase wealth, but it also concentrates wealth in fewer and fewer hands, which again, some people find a very agreeable kind of idea. Anyway, the idea has been that we couldn't provide enough food for everybody unless we do that kind of thing, because that kind of farming is maximally productive. And the idea has been too, excuse me, which really dates from the end of the 18th century with Thomas Robert Malthus, known as Bob, very cosily, but he was Malthus, gloomy man. Anyway, he said, as you will all remember, the human race is bound to go on increasing exponentially, but the increase in agricultural output, which at that time was beginning to look quite good, will only increase arithmetically, and there's going to be a greater and greater divergence until we collapse. A lot of politicians still believe that as the model of human growth, 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 growth. Collapse. Now, several things. You made the point just now, and that in fact, we don't, and I'm sorry, so what emerged from that kind of thinking, A, that there's an alleged food shortage, and B, that the population is going on rising and rising and rising, and C, that we need the industrial kind to keep pace. What emerged from that is the kind of statement that first came out of FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, around about 2008, which is that in order to keep pace, just to keep pace with rising population, we need probably to double food output by, or was it increase it by 50%? No, 50% increase by 2050, that kind of figure. So we need production, production, production. And some people have upped to the ante and said, no, we actually need to double output by the end of the century just to keep pace with the rising population. Now, that's kind of thesis has become sort of current law, what all self-respecting secretaries of state like to believe, etc., take for granted. But in fact, that's been seriously challenged in the last few years, and we now know it's not true. And one of the few people in high places who genuinely understands agriculture and cares about it is a guy called Hans Herren, who is president of the Millennium Institute based in Washington, D.C., and he points out that the world already produces about twice as much as we really need. Now, this sounds like a sort of, a sensationalist figure grabbed out of the air, but actually it's very easy to demonstrate statistically, and you could look up the figures in Google and see it for yourself, that the world already produces 2.5 billion tons of cereal per year. Now, 1 ton of cereal, metric, doesn't matter if it's a metric ton or an imperial ton, because they're more or less the same, 1 ton of cereal will provide enough calories and protein, in other words, enough macronutrient to feed 3 people for 1 year. So if we produce 2.5 billion tons of cereal, we're actually producing enough macronutrient in cereals alone to feed the entire population. But, excuse me, oh dear, hay fever and all sorts of stuff. But, in fact, cereals are by far the most important thing, provide us with only about half our food, and the rest is tubers and nuts and pulses and meat and fish and dairy. But cereal is only about half. So if cereals provide enough for everybody, the present population, the whole lot is twice. That's a sort of rough arithmetic, but it works. As for population, it is true that the population is still rising. It is not true that populations rise exponentially forever in the way that Malthus thought. Excuse me. And if you look at the demographic curve of any creature, including human beings, it will go up like this exponentially for a time, and then it will start to level out. And after a time, it will start to fall. Now, in the 1970s, when the World Food Conference took place, world population was still rising very, very fast indeed. It was doubling every 40 years, roughly. It was just under, or about 2% growth a year, which is doubling every 40 years because of compound interest. So it looked dreadful because we were on about 4 billion then, so then we'd go to 8 billion by now, 16 billion, 32 billion by the end of the century. Disaster. Anyway, but it doesn't do that. That's not how populations do it. The populations actually do this. And at the moment, we're on the leveling out bit. So the population is still beginning to rise in arithmetical terms, but the percentage rate of increase is falling. And the calculation is for the United Nations that the population should start to level out by the time they get to the end of this century, by which time, they keep having to up it a bit, by which time we should be on 9 to 11 billion.
If we're still here.
If we still here. But that is, of course, a huge number, so nobody's saying agriculture doesn't have to be productive.
Yeah.
But we're already producing more than we should ever really need, and the emphasis can move away from production. The other side of the standard, I know, I'll stop it a bit. The other side of the standard equation is that you can only do this by industrial means, only raise.
Yeah.
That also is wrong. And if you, the most productive, I mean, it's been demonstrated several times, lots of times, the most productive in terms of food per hectare or per acre is small mixed farms that are beautifully run and cared for, basically well-run small holdings, outstrip
which produce 70% of the world's food already.
And they provide, I'm never quite sure of this, whether it's 70% of the world's food or whether it's that they actually feed 70% of the world's population, which I think is the proper figure.
Yeah.
But the point is that this big industrial type farming, which we're supposed to need, A, is not the most productive in terms of food per acre, and B is we don't really need it anyway. So the whole kind of philosophy is wrong, and is rethinking from first principles. That's the thesis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And definitely there will be lots of time for questions, but if I could ask you just to, we can certainly come back to this in the question time, but just to sort of keep this going for a little bit longer, and then we'll open it up to the floor. But I think, there are a number of things that come up there, but this notion, and I think films like Cowspiracy, for example, and I know this is a very sort of controversial area and people have very sort of strong opinions about it, but I think, and I've got absolutely I'm not a vegan myself, but I completely see that we should be eating like 95% less meat or across the board. But these arguments are predicated on the notion that we can only farm and feed the world in these methods that have essentially only been with us for a few decades, really since the Second World War. And until early last century, we didn't farm like this. But these arguments are largely predicated on the notion that if we're going to have meat and dairy, we've got to have thousands of animals in a feedlot. It totally discounts the notion that livestock have been an absolutely essential part of a sustainable agroecological systems for millennia. And there are an awful lot of people out there, and I've been reading an awful lot in this area recently, who will tell you we simply cannot rebuild topsoil in the rates that we need to without livestock. And there are extraordinary things going on in like North Dakota, 10,000 acre ranches that have turned 5 inches of dead topsoil into 18 inches of organic soil in under 10 years, just through the intelligent management of livestock. And this is all slightly influenced by this guy, Alan Savory, in Zimbabwe, who spent years as a conservationist looking at the way that migrating animals, herbivores, move through the landscape. And when they actually do so in the natural way, they don't lead to overgrazing and desertification. They lead to precisely the opposite. They can actually rebuild landscapes. They can actually, because of things like the compression of their hooves, opens up, aerates the soil, allows the water to penetrate the soil, drives the microbial life down into the soil, and generates organic matter. 20 years ago when I wrote this book, people still didn't understand soil biology like we do now, and still thought that it took hundreds or thousands of years to produce topsoil. And at current rates of the topsoil erosion, we won't have harvests by the middle of this century. So it ultimately, I believe, much of this comes down to soil, that if we can rebuild soil, we can rebuild our nutrition, we can rebuild local economies, we can rebuild communities. I think it was Roosevelt who said, that if those who sort of destroy the soil destroy civilization. The soil is absolutely critical, and we know an awful lot more about soil now. And I've been reading, there's some very, very quite staggering claims being made by some of these people, which I'd love to ask Colin about. But there are certainly people saying you only need to raise the average organic soil content of half the world's arable land by something like 1 or 2%. To bring carbon back to pre-industrial levels. And if, and it's a huge if we were able to roll this out and replicate it on a massive wide scale, mass mobilized across the planet, it could be done incredibly quickly, like within the space of a generation. And I'm sure you're aware of Paul Hawken's work in the States. He's got a project called Drawdown, and it's in a book where he highlights 100 of the most efficient mechanisms for us to mitigate climate change and to draw carbon back down. And what is absolutely apparent is that photosynthesis is still by far and away the most efficient way to draw carbon back down out of the, and things like carbon capture and all these crazy geoengineering schemes, which of course what the media settles on, are, to my mind, one of the most effective ways for us to actually deal with this, the biggest challenge of all. And here, I think it's something like 50 gigatons of carbon. It's a number. I think he rates regenerative agriculture as one of the most efficient ways we can systemically solve climate change, so many of our other social and economic issues. But what I find very interesting is something like David Wallace Wells' book, An Uninhabitable Earth, which is this devastating sort of distillation of all of this climate science, literally brushes over it in one sentence and discards it as saying it's completely unproven and gives it no attention at all. And he then writes a paragraph about geoengineering. So although I think that's a laudable book, I do think it's very interesting how anything that potentially is a systemic solution gets thrown to one side. But also then just going back, also this crucial point about the economics. I think however much we sort of get carried away about the possibilities of amazing eco-technologies or the regenerative farming, none of these things are going to be viable without a massive systems change within our economic system. Because we need to shift from this purely quantitative growth model to a more qualitative development model. And Herman Daly made this distinction back in the 1950s. He was the first sort of ecological economist. Growing economies is getting bigger. A developing economy is getting better. Edward Aby, always the novelist, famously said, growth for the sake of growth is the philosophy of a cancer cell. But still, here we are with politicians clinging to this completely ludicrous notion of infinite growth on a finite planet with finite resources. So I absolutely, what I'm driving at is, ultimately, and this is why I've sort of, I'm very taken with this word regeneration. It sort of came out of my fascination with regenerative farming. But it also then realized that this applies to everything, that actually sustainability has become this very co-opted corporate greenwash word, which ultimately, as my brother Hugo likes to say, is ultimately about doing business a little less badly than we were doing it before. When actually what we need to do, we can't incrementally optimize things that are fundamentally broken and expect them to work anything better than a little bit better than before. We need new models that make those models obsolete. We need new systems. And as David Lloyd George said, you can't cross a chasm in two leaps. You can't take these models and turn them and somehow tweak them into the models we want. They've actually, they need to be refashioned from the ground up, as you say. So this is the biggest question of all in all of these areas. How do we get there from here? However much XR and all of these civil disobedience movements might rattle the cage of the political elite and the status quo and the establishment, etc., is there not an argument that our energy might be, or some of our energy, or much of our energy is best spent trying to put these new models into practice? And as you say, the politicians aren't going to do it for us. They don't understand systems thinking and basic ecological principles. They just don't get it. So it's kind of up to us. And I think that's what's percolating through to people now. I mean, it's a pity it didn't happen maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but I think we're recognizing that the change that we wish to see in all of these areas, it's up to us. These guys aren't going to do it. They can't. And the corporate vested interests and the lobbying groups and the rest of it are so powerful that even though ExxonMobil did some of the early climate change research in the world's oceans in the 1970s, they've known full well all of this stuff for decades. So they're not going to just roll over. So the big question for me, really is what, and I'm sure for many people who come to these sorts of discussions, this is all great, what we're hearing, there are sort of solution models, but how do we individually, collectively as a family or as a community or as a business, how do we best get at this and be useful?
Good.
Sorry, I got off on a long ramble there, but there we go.
No, jolly good. I shall answer in kind.
Thank you. I thought I'd give you a little break with your parched throat.
Well, good idea. I like very much, basically, in general response to your question, how do you affect the kind of change we need to make, etc. And basically, I think there are three ways in which people try to change society and the way we live and all that kind of thing. And the first of those is reform. And as you say, step by step, incremental step from where we are to where we need to be. And I love that quote from Lloyd George, that there are some chasms you just can't, you've got to make leaps. So reform achieves a great deal. Where would we be without it? Almost ended slavery and all that kind of stuff. But not going to solve our problems on its own. The second way forward in theory, and has often happened, is revolution, of course, all-out revolution. My feelings about revolution, sometimes it seems to be unavoidable, really, frankly, because you've tried everything else, but it's not, on the whole, a good idea. In politics, the principle of non-linearity always applies. You really don't know how whatever you do is going to turn out. I mean, the election of Boris is as Private Eye said, a huge leap in the dark for humankind. And that is... That is the case in all politics, but revolutions, it applies particularly. And I don't think any revolution ever worked out the way its initiators intended. Even the American Revolution, revolt against Britain in the late 18th century, within a few decades or within a few years, the founding fathers of that were saying, actually, it's not working out the way we wanted, chaps. We're not getting the society we wanted. So revolutions never quite hit them, and sometimes they go disastrously wrong, and sometimes they're put into reverse, etc. There is a third way forward, which has long been called Renaissance, rebirth. And the last, of course, of the most famous Renaissance was the so-called Italian Renaissance of the 15th century, sort of hastened the end of the Middle Ages in Europe and ushered in modernity for good or for not so good. But we all know that was a complete rethink and a restart. That particular Renaissance was begun with intellectuals and artists and bankers, in fact. So it's a top-down thing, really. And as you were saying, the next change has to be people-led. So we need a Renaissance, but we need it to be people-led. The Renaissance has to be across the board. So everything. We have to be rethinking healthcare and education and transport and everything. But to me, there is nothing more important. I think it's obvious, actually, but one seems to need to say it. There's nothing more important than food production, agriculture, and the food culture that makes the agriculture work. So the Renaissance that we need now, I think, should begin with an agrarian Renaissance. And the question is, how do you bring that about? And there's lots of ways, but there are things, there again, the word reform. Land reform is obviously a priority. But it's not a total disaster. I mean, it isn't the case, for example, that all landowners are bad. Mm-hmm. And one might want to one does, in fact, want to make the land, all the land in Britain more available to more people to do more things. But there are certainly landowners that I know who very much agree with that. People who have big estates, and what they actually want to do is to invite small farmers to come and do their thing, and wildlife friendly and so on and so on. So it's not quite, land reform is vital, but it's not just a question of bashing landowners, although many of them do need a very severe bashing. But it is a question, I think, the more and more one can encourage certain things. And one of the things that really needs encouraging is in community ownership of land. And things like CSAs, community-supported agriculture. And ad hoc relationships between cities or villages and local farmers, so that you get a a local economy based on farming. The principle is that of subsidiarity, which is recognized by the EU, which is that you don't, everything that should be, governance should always be at the lowest feasible profit public. Incidentally, just as an aside, and then I'll stop, maybe everybody else would like to talk, but the concept of subsidiarity, believe it or not, was introduced by the Roman Catholic Church in the 19th century.
Right.
And basically the Pope was saying, I don't want to have to deal with everything. You can deal with it at the diocese level. And then the diocese would say, well, I don't want to deal with everything. You can deal with it at the parish level. And basically that's the principle that one ought to apply to agriculture. And indeed, it is the principle that ought to underpin the whole of the Renaissance that's now required. So that's a broad response to...
No, that's fantastic. A couple more things I want to talk about before we open up for some questions. This notion of agroecology or the crucial importance of trees.
Oh, yeah.
And the trees that we should be planting as opposed to the trees that we shouldn't be planting.
Yeah.
I think that's something I'd love to hear you talk about.
Yeah.
So maybe, let's just deal with that. And then also I'd love to just a little bit more on the metaphysical question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Well, agroecology, different people define it in different ways. But I define it as, I'll think of it as agriculture that seeks, in effect, to emulate nature. And nature can be extremely fickle, it's not in our control and all those things, and it can be immensely destructive. But it also exhibits, I think that's the sort of word people use, the precise qualities that we now need. I mean, we need agriculture not only to be productive enough, but we need it to be sustainable, horrible word, but we all know roughly what it means. And we need it to be resilient, because conditions are going to change. Even if we get on top of climate change, which I hope we can and will, there's going to be massive changes on that front, and lots of other fronts as well. So you want agriculture to be productive enough, but also sustainable and resilient. And nature has been supremely sustainable. There's been wild nature on this earth apparently for nearly 4 billion years, which is sustainable enough. And of course it's incredibly resilient. And it's endured ice ages and continental drift and all that sort of stuff, comes smiling through, usually better than it was before. So we should ask the question, what does nature do that makes it so resilient and sustainable, and can we emulate it with farming? And there's various answers to what it does. One is that nature is very, very diverse, and it has what some ecologists call built-in redundancy. And redundancy is something that factory owners hate, and everybody, office owners hate, because you don't employ 2 people where you could employ 1 and all that kind of thing, and you'd have just-in-time delivery and all that kind of stuff. Yep. Very, very precarious. Nature is wonderfully redundant, so that, for example, people think that the only pollinator in this country is the honey bee. Well, in fact, there are hundreds of pollinators. Including, in this country alone, well over 200 species of solitary bees, which are all great pollinators, and flies and moths and some birds, not hummingbirds, but not so much in this country, obviously. But the point is, you see, nature allows many, many different species to do the same thing. So if one goes, it doesn't matter. Whereas the so-called efficiency of the factory, one thing goes and the whole thing is up the creek. So anyway, diversity is what gives you this built-in, etc., resilience and so on and so on. Nature is also wonderfully economical in terms of natural resources. I mean, every ecosystem borrows from every other ecosystem. And we're all sitting here breathing, at least we're all breathing, and we're all taking in oxygen. And the oxygen, some of it may have been produced by those trees over there, which makes it nice and local. Some of it, probably quite a lot, has been produced by some diatom in the middle of some distant ocean. So, okay, all ecosystems borrow to an extent. But what they don't do, they don't use fossil fuels. And the only things that ecosystems use, I think will be a true 100% generalization. They don't use stuff that's not renewable. Yeah. Or if they do, it's temporary, etc., etc. So there's that thing, economical and diverse. Nature is very, very synergistic, so that nothing is really wasted. You know, one animal's poo is another animal's or another creature's provender, nutrition. So, you know, all this beautiful stuff like that. And a farmer can do this, you see. And the ideal, it's not something you can always do, but the ideal and the equivalent of the diversity of nature is to have mixed farms, mixtures of crops and livestock integrated, working together, and not only to have different species working together, but also to have genetic diversity within species. So the clone becomes the precise opposite, well, they're all genetically identical, to what you really need. And you go on and say, well, if you have a system, and low input, of course, translates, roughly speaking, into organic farming, where you use the stuff that's renewable and all that stuff. If you have a system which is very diverse and synergistic and organic, it's going to be very, very complicated. But the complexity is deliberate. It's an emulation of nature. And if you have a system which is very complex, etc., and diverse, and you can't get away with not having any people. So you say, if you're going to have this agroecological agriculture, it has to be skills intensive. Let's just not say labor intensive, because that implies that you should be using slaves where you should be using tractors. Well, no, of course not. You should use tractors where you need tractors, albeit solar powered, but you know what I mean. But it does mean that you need loads and lots of skilled farmers. This country needs 1 million more farmers right now in order to farm properly. And it also means if you have organized enterprises, a farm enterprise, which is complex and skills intensive and low input, there is very, very little advantage. In fact, there's a severe disadvantage in scale up. There's lots of advantages in small units combining into cooperatives, but there's none in trying to turn little units into big units. And yet, again, the thrust of big business is to get rid of the labor. Zero labor agriculture is many people's ideal. It is to make the crops and the animals as uniform as possible, which means more or less genetically identical, so that you get complete predictability in theory, makes them extremely vulnerable to pests, etc. And if you have zero labor, etc., huge inputs of agrochemicals and stuff to keep the disease at bay, then there's enormous advantage in scale up. The bigger the better. Earl Butz, who was America's Secretary of State in the 70s to people, 60s and 70s to people like Gerald Ford and Nixon and so on, Reagan, he said, get big or get out. And that basically is the philosophy of the present British government and the sort of official policy. But actually we need the small mixed farm and practicing agroecology, low input, diverse, etc.
Brilliant. I think what you touched on there is actually sort of fundamental to all the topics that we're going to be talking about. In a sense, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, we've become this sort of anomaly in the sense that we've separated ourselves from the rest of the natural world, not just sort of metaphysically and conceptually, for all sorts of factors, which I would love to go on to, but also by creating waste. No other species has created waste. And if you think about it, it's a fairly sort of extraordinary achievement, or not a very brilliant one, but essentially we've turned all of these cyclical systems into linear ones. And that's why, I mean, the disruption of the carbon cycle and climate change is the biggest and most catastrophic example of that. But single-use plastic and everywhere you look. The problem is we've created linear systems when we need cyclical systems. And this requires, whether it's the circular economy or the regenerative farming, any of these issues, we need to start, embracing what is essentially this systemic ecological thinking. So this is what I really, my son's studying economics A-level, he doesn't even touch on systems thinking. I mean, it's just sort of absolutely unbelievable to me that, people are still being taught this incredibly outdated worldview and vision of economics. But then also this business, I mean, I'm reminded of this wonderful quote from a late Roman poet who said the true sign of the age of decadence is when the chefs become the celebrities. And I think we've sort of seen that sort of happen over the last 20, 30 years or whatever. And what I'm really wondering now, Colin nearly came to a festival I organised in Spain last year, but unfortunately couldn't travel. But we wanted to have a talk there, and we probably will next year, is can we make farmers the new rock stars? It's how can we incentivize and make it sexy and glamorous for people to go back to the land when everything is kind of, from a sort of mainstream media point of view, trying to tell them the direct opposite. But I kind of feel it's sort of happening anyway, and the awareness is so out there and rising that people realize that, actually, if I'm out there doing something really useful in terms of feeding the world, I might be rather more useful than sitting in an office, tapping away at whatever. So that's an interesting question for me. But before we just have some questions now, just quickly on your new book and this notion around the perennial philosophy, which was this word that Aldous Huxley didn't coin, but he famously titled a book about it, which is trying to draw a correlation, a single strand that connects all the world's sort of mystical and religious traditions. And for me, I've had a deep interest in this now for 20 plus years, because I think that the conceptual separation that we have indoctrinated ourselves into, and which ultimately is completely illusory. If it doesn't take that long to think about it, you realize we can't possibly be separate from nature. But that is what most of us have been led to believe. And there are an enormous number of people now out there in different scientific disciplines working in this consciousness arena, from neuroscience to transpersonal psychology to molecular biology and quantum physics, the rest of it, who are coming to very similar conclusions to what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years, that consciousness is not this mysterious phenomenon, epiphenomenon as they call it, that is generated by complex neuronal firing inside our skulls. That actually it's something much more fundamental to the nature of reality and the universe itself, and what the Buddhists call the ground of all being. And my sort of pet theory, if you like, is that because the scientific priesthood has replaced our religious traditions for most people as where they get their information and what they see as the truth or the worldview and paradigm that they embrace, if the scientific community suddenly realizes that the weight of empirical evidence for non-local consciousness outweighs, because there's zero proof that consciousness is produced by the brain, as much as we like to believe it, there isn't actually any proof. And in fact, there's more proof now that it's not, according to many people, and more proof that consciousness is something much more fundamental. So my vision, my hope is that we might see, and I've heard very sort of prominent neuroscientists and stuff saying within 5 or 10 years it's going to be impossible for any serious scientist to maintain that consciousness is generated by the brain, because the weight of evidence is going to get overwhelming. And then you'll see this paradigm shift within the scientific community, where this notion of confirmation bias, which is Rupert Sheldrake has written quite interestingly about, when people don't like to shake the paradigm, and people who are dependent upon sort of research grants and the rest of it, if they're pursuing a bit of research which is contrary to that, they're not likely to get the money to do it. So what they might believe in their inner heart might not correspond to what they're putting out there, in terms of their research and the rest of it. So my hope is that if that does happen, there could be a momentous sort of Copernican shift in our understanding of who and what we are in relation to each other and to nature itself and the rest of the universe, and that might enable us to re-inform our politics and our economics in a way that makes the regeneration possible. And we actually start to realize we're not these atomized individuals locked up in, as Alan Watts said, sort of skin-encapsulated egos, but something much, much greater. So does that sort of have any correlation with your thoughts in this area of where we might be heading, or what is necessary on a metaphysical or spiritual level, whatever you want to call that, because it seems to me that while we still labour under these misapprehensions, we're like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You know.
I agree. Difficult to answer all that.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
But what strikes me, I like. First of all, I like the idea of the perennial wisdom, and it's quite hard to sort of. If you wanted to say, are there absolute truths out there that you could grasp? Well, I would have to say there may be, but it's beyond our ken to grasp them. So the perennial wisdom to me, and I think it's a lovely expression, is the sum total of all the best thoughts of human beings have ever had that strike us as being true and important. And among them are ideas like compassion, for example, the sort of universal idea that's a good thing, and humility, universal idea that humility is a good thing, respect for nature, universal moral principle, found in all religions, although in some more than others. And these kind of ideas contribute. Also, there's this grand metaphysical idea, and it's a great pity that the whole idea of metaphysics seems to have gone missing. And the great dichotomy, as I see it, is part of what you're saying, or your parallel with, is that the great sort of enlightenment engender of the 18th century, although one shouldn't sort of misrepresent it because it was actually very complicated, etc. But the general idea was that it was based on the idea of rationality, so-called, and rationality was sort of about calculation and cerebration and good thought rather than emotional. It's don't get carried away by the passion, so-called, and all that. And this gave rise to the idea that, and especially when you start stirring in maths, that you can achieve certainty. Right. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the whole idea of the material universe. Mm-hmm. You know, the universe is just stuff, and as you say, everything else is an epiphenomenon. And by the time you got to the early 20th century with the logical positivists, they were saying no idea should be taken seriously that you can't verify, in effect meaning prove. And the only ideas that you can verify are those of science. And the only ideas of science that you could verify and are worth taking seriously are those based in material stuff. Mm-hmm. So you've got the complete thing, you know, the sort of logical rationality, materialism, etc., etc. What was absent from the whole logical positivist idea? Well, several things. One is that there is no certainty, that you can't actually prove anything at all beyond all possible doubt. So you could, and as Karl Popper said, you could only, in the end, disprove things that are obviously not true. So the whole idea that you really can prove things went by the board. And then people started to say, well, actually, the whole idea that there is this, you know, that logical and material and measurement and all that will lead us to truth is itself an unprovable proposition. And the whole idea, too, that the universe, as you were saying, is just stuff, and everything else is an epiphenomenon, that is a sort of quite convenient for doing certain forms of science, but it cannot be taken as a bedrock truth. And what was missing was the idea, which of course runs right at the basis of all religions, which is the idea of transcendence. Broadly speaking, there's more to the universe than meets the eye. And the idea of embedded consciousness being a part of the universe is, I see it, very much a part of the general idea of transcendence, that there is more, etc., etc., etc. The other thing that this whole way of thinking engenders in spades, really, is humility. And the present sort of agricultural paradigm, which says we can redesign nature from scratch because we know we can understand DNA and we can do genetic engineering, we can recreate organisms, which you hear from these people at the top. One tends to say to yourself, well, come on, you're dealing here with areas that actually you don't understand at all, really. No. You have a few insights into a few mechanisms, and you're trying to build a whole world on this. Yep. And the thing is that this sort of more, the kind of broader view of which questions whether materialism, etc., and calculation really give you the truth, once you start to see that that's flawed, and you start to approach nature with humility, then you start to say, actually, we can't just take it by the scruff of the neck and beat it up and hope to get perfect results. You know, it doesn't work like that. So it underpins the whole idea of agroecology, etc., because the agroecologist is a truly modern scientist who says, actually, we're dealing with uncertainty here, we're dealing with unknowns. The only way to do it is to approach it with cautiousness, and instead of trying to replace nature, ask what it does well and emulate it.
Well, and that's what's so apparent from something like Isabella Tree's book and the work they've done at NEP, and I highly recommend, if anybody's not read that book, I mean, it's the most hopeful book in this area I've read.
What's that book?
Isabella Tree's book, Wilding.
Very good, yeah.
Just to see what has happened in that estate within 10 years, just by largely being left alone, minimal human interference, just the introduction of key herbivores, and in terms of, the biodiversity that's come to that estate within 10 years is absolutely staggering. Now, I'm sure you've all heard plenty from us, and I start with this gentleman who wanted a question first, and then this lady here on the sofa.
It's
So,
picking up on the thing about soil degrading,
yeah,
loss of soils.
yeah.
You're saying that 30% of our food is generated by the large industrial scale.
Sorry, I'm very deaf as well as everything else.
So again, it's about soil degrading
Yeah.
and about the ongoing loss of soils, particularly from the large-scale industrial-style agriculture,
Yeah.
which is a significant part of our food production system. I read somewhere that they're expecting us to have maybe only 60 harvests left from industrial-scale agriculture. And if you get more than one harvest a year, that might be only 30, 40 years' time. So it's in our lifetimes, or certainly in our children's lifetimes. I don't see any sense of there being a shift away from large-scale agriculture, and no sense of urgency out there, certainly without politicians and with citizens in general. What is there that we can do to try and get that on the agenda, to get people to realise that we have to act now, because even if we act now, the soil, the industrial farms are going to take decades to disappear and go back to being the organic, small-scale mixed farming that you've been promoting for decades.
Well, all I can say actually is that lots of people are on the case. And for example, in this country, a very, very good movement is the Land Workers Alliance, which you may or may not have heard of. But that's got very intelligent people there, and mostly young, many of them under 30, who understand all these points absolutely. And they, well, among other things, in parallel with that, there are also various movements to establish community-owned agriculture and community-run agriculture. Very strong, necessary movement. You start to put that together, and Rory mentioned Paul Hawken. There's the idea that actually if you look around the world at all the people who are on the case, there is already easily a critical mass of people who could make the change that's needed by buying land, by doing things differently, etc. And to make the mass go critical, it's really a question of spreading the information and getting people together and all that kind of stuff. This kind of meeting, this kind of gathering, I think is a very important part of the kind of things that are happening. I wish I could say that there is a concerted global movement to do all the things. And there isn't a concerted global movement, but there's loads and loads of people on the case in all kinds of contexts, including Isabella Tree and so on and so on. Not a brilliant answer, but the best I can do.
I think very all I would potentially add is I suppose that as these big monocultures get threatened by a pest, a blight, or whatever, like the corn blight in the 70s in the States, or the Dust Bowl of the 30s, which many people say is coming to the Midwest in America very soon, that inevitably the only models that are still producing food and have still got thriving topsoil and biodiversity are those that have embraced these principles. So I do believe that the new model can arise within the shell of the old, and that's very much what all of this is about, I think, in all of these different areas. Sorry, yeah?
I was going to say, obviously, agroecology, broadly speaking, in structural terms, is based in very much in traditional agriculture. So it looks old-fashioned, but it isn't. That's a sort of paradox. It's hyper-modern. But I don't want to say, which is a huge mistake some people do make, that all traditional agriculture is good, because it very, very obviously isn't. and in parts of Africa, for example, massive overgrazing and so on and so on and so on. Much of that was imposed because people were forced onto smaller and smaller areas and rougher ground and so on. And the kind of destruction of, well, let's call it that, of parts of Wales by too many sheep is, which George Monbiot goes on about. Again, I believe it's the case, I haven't really looked into it, but that what you've got there is overstocking that was brought about by government policy, because government started rewarding people for having more livestock. So I think a lot of the farmers know that it's overgrazed and there's too many and all that. One of the things about Isabella Tree, as Rory said, is that they use their ungulates, their ruminants in particular, and horses and pigs, as substitutes for the wild species. So they've got horses which stand in for the old tarpans that used to be the wild horses, and they use old-fashioned breeds of cattle, I can't remember what actually.
Yes,
Whatever it is, but to stand in for the old aurochs and so on.
Bison and aurochs.
Yeah.
But they haven't been allowed to introduce beavers yet.
Sorry?
They want to introduce beavers, but they haven't been allowed to introduce beavers.
Oh, beavers, yeah.
Yeah.
There are beavers being reintroduced, as you know.
But in the States, yeah, obviously they've done extraordinary things there.
There's some very good ones in Cornwall.
Yeah. This lady here.
A very different question, a very practical question.
Sorry.
What practical advice would you give to a top quality agriculture graduate today who is now thinking, hang on a minute, but if you say spiritual and at one with nature, he raises his eyes and thinks, mum's off on one again. But he's got to move forward, given he's a product of the current academic system.
Yeah, that's right.
He's got to move forward to make his own life and a living, and he's a bit...
I'm not
That's why I think this word metaphysical needs to sort of probably come back into our lexicon, because I think it's quite a good substitute word for spiritual, which for a lot of people is an immediate sort of, an immediate eye-rolling.
It's certainly not part of anything he has been taught or introduced to, particularly in connection with making his own living. And there's many of them from there.
But it's, there's Colins Amazing College, there's an amazing regenerative agriculture college in Holland I know about as well. I mean, there are these places appearing around the globe that are espousing these kind of techniques, but of course we've got these things running in parallel to the conventional ones. So I would say, I'll hand over to Colin now, but I would say read his book first, would be my first thing. Yeah.
I am writing another book that will summarise it all. I'll plug that 2 years in advance. But I mean, actually, it simply is the case that a lot of education in this country and the world over, including science and economics in particular, is a disaster. I mean, no question. PPE at Oxford, the economists themselves say it's dreadful. No mention of anything that's really important and pertinent to the, to the real world, etc., etc. I can't say anything to your graduate. Is he your son? But
this lady in the blue over here, and then we've got probably time for one more after that.
So thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to spend all my festival money at the bookshop. Such a lot of really interesting recommendations. But I want to pick up on this notion of reformation, revolution, or renaissance.
yeah.
Now, renaissance, regeneration, totally, absolutely, that's what has got to happen. But we have 12 years, maybe 25 years. Revolution is the only answer. But before you think I'm an old Marxist, which I am, the non-violent revolution, the civil disobedience that XR are developing, that's what we have to see all over the world. And it's only then that governments will tremble. And I would like, it's a small example, but the Portuguese in the 1970s got rid of Salazar, the Carnation Revolution, without a shot being fired. So everybody, you need to engage in civil disobedience. We haven't got much time.
No, I think that's absolutely wonderful. Quite agree. And what I would urge everybody to come to Bruce Parry's talk at 7 o'clock this evening in the Park stage here, because this is precisely one of the areas that I think Bruce is going to be tackling around peaceful revolution. So do come and hear Bruce later. And Colin, I don't know if there's something you'd like to say to that.
No, I mean, jolly good, yes.
I mean, one more question, because I know it's getting hot in here and you probably all died to get out. Yes. Yeah, no, I completely subscribe to that. Absolutely. So, yeah.
I think as well, especially for your son, the thing that got me into the metaphysical or spiritual thing is that permaculture is kind of a great gateway drug to all of that. But understanding the systems, he kind of, and Wallace really nicely combines kind of systems thinking and agroecological principles. And just by understanding those kind of inherent with that, you get to grips with the nature and
I think that's a really crucial point, and I was reading in one of the papers the other day, I can't remember who it was, but it was a celebrity who'd read Isabella Tree's book, saying my understanding of nature was completely overturned by that book. And I think, it's just understanding these basic principles that Colin touched on, about how how through diversity and complexity we build resistance and resilience to disease, the capacities for adaptation and self-regulation, all of these things increase. And that's what is missing from our general worldview, and that's why we're so out of step. We're so locked into this linear A leads to B narrative that we've completely alienated ourselves from the true interconnected, interdependent, systemic way that the world operates. And I think as soon as those kind of penny drop moments happen for people, it's like, okay, wow, we can just, and some of these tweaks, I think, are not necessarily that massive. We've just got to sort of shift, from here to there and start, rather than just trying to make it a little less bad, what we're doing out there, whether it's, just to start regenerating and replenishing the soil, introducing systems that are actively not just making the world a little less bad, but actively making it better. And then, if we mass mobilized as a species over the next 30 years in one generation by 2050, we could absolutely undoubtedly leave the planet in a better state than it is now. It's possible, but we're led to believe that it's not. And that's why I think these discussions are so important. That's why I'm incredibly grateful that you're all here, and I'm incredibly grateful for Colin coming all this way. Thank you so much, Colin Tudge.